up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Szamotah and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. Happy Friday night, my friend. How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual, and happy Friday to you too.
We are recording this on an unusual recording day. Very rarely do we record this podcast on a Friday. It is Friday, April 15th. We have no idea when we're actually going to release this episode. It's kind of like one of those shows that we are kind of stockpiling. We're in the process of stockpiling shows in the event that, I don't know, one of us can't make a show or something like that. So we're trying to record as much as possible so we can always have steady content. But today we're going to do an episode on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is history related and kind of current, depending on when this episode releases. Hopefully when this episode releases, the war in Ukraine is over and all is well and there's no threat of nuclear war. I'm not holding my breath. That is going to be something. But yeah, how's it going? Sorry for my long-winded rant.
No, man, I'm doing good. And you're right. I think that, you know, when we came up with this idea to do the Cuban Missile Crisis, it felt like the right time to cover this particular history topic because there are so many people right now that are, you know, ratcheting up the nuclear war fear. And, you know, it's not totally unfounded. But, you know, in researching this, I think I found some pretty interesting parallels. And, you know, maybe if we have time, we can go through them. But, you know, just mostly I wanted to, you know, explore the one time in history where we came closest to an actual nuclear war, just to give a little bit of context around how scary that is and how quickly you know, the situation can devolve into, you know, a calamity. But also, I think what we'll probably cover at length is that oftentimes, you know, these types of crises are political, you know, in nature and less so military. And we'll definitely talk about how, you know, politics kind of injects itself in and in at least in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly doesn't make us any safer. But yeah, I don't want to give away too many of the goods before we jump in. But where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, to your point, Justin Raimondo's theory on foreign policy is that all foreign policy is domestic policy.
Okay, fair.
Where I want to start, though, just like with the modern day context, I have trouble believing how comfortable people are with like the looming threat of nuclear war upon them.
Same. Yeah, same.
Like I feel like I'm the only, like there's an alien that only I can see. Like that little green man on the plane or the clown on the plane. I don't know. I
think you're thinking of the Twilight Zone, like the man on the wing, and you're like, yeah, what the fuck?
The man on
There's
the
a
wing.
guy on the wing.
I feel like I'm the only one who can see it. Everyone else is like going on with their day and happy, and I go to bed and I'm scared about nuclear war. I totally get like you ever watch Tremors? The movie Tremors. Do you know? Oh man,
with Shia LaBeouf.
You gotta watch that. No, it's no Shia. It's an old school Kevin Bacon, like sci-fi corny horror film. But it's like
I was thinking
one
of
of the best ones
for some reason. I think that was the Shia
it's not
LaBeouf one.
Holes. It's both in the desert. This is about like little worms, like these monster worms that pop out of the ground and they eat people.
Okay.
And they appear in the middle of nowhere in Nevada and they like terrorize this small town. And one of the characters is named Burt Gummer. And Burt Gummer is like he's a gun nut prepper who's been preparing for World War III his entire life. And he finally, you know, gets to use all of his like survival skills and his weapons on these worms that are popping out of the ground. But they made like a whole series. It's like there's a whole cult following behind this show or behind this movie.
What does this have to do
it was one of
with
my
the Cuban
favorites as a
Missile
kid. What's that? It has nothing to do with it, but I just feel like that really went off in a tangent. Anyone who grew up watching Tremors will definitely relate to this. If I had an argument with Al about Tremors or Twister, and She said Twitter. I'm not. She said Twister, and I said Tremors. But she can be wrong. But yeah, my point is that I feel like Burt Gummer, the character in that movie,
the prepper,
like the prepper, and like we used to laugh at preppers. But yeah, I just feel weird. I just feel it's weird how hostile the rhetoric can be when there is this possible threat. But
yeah, man. I mean, we talked about on the show at least a few times, certain proposals that have been making their rounds in the Beltway about how maybe a tactical nuclear strike could be beneficial, in particular to show China who's boss. And there was also an article that we took a look at for one episode where they were saying that a small nuclear war would do really good for global warming because it would kick up a bunch of sediment into the atmosphere and thus cool off the earth. And it's just, I feel you, man. It just feels like, are we crazy? Like, this is what we're talking about. This is like on the table right now. But I can empathize with you in that respect. It's weird.
It's like that viral video that from, I think it was like a year ago, where this couple got into a fight with this guy over snow. Like they were shoveling snow in this guy's yard, and he came out and he started yelling at him, or it was vice versa. They got into a huge argument over shoveling snow or a snowblower, and the couple starts yelling at the guy. He's like, fuck you, you pussy. We're gonna make your life hell. And the guy comes out with a gun.
Jesus.
And they're still screaming at him like, do it, pussy. We're gonna make your life hell. And the guy ends up killing him. It's like a very crazy video.
Fuck.
But this is what it reminds me of. Like it's,
Brinkmanship.
we're really playing with fire, and we threw diplomacy out the window. But yeah, Let's get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is when JFK almost got everyone in the world killed over the neoliberal obsession with international credibility.
Okay.
There's the podcast. So when JFK almost got everyone in the world killed, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I mean, that's kind of staunchly different take from the basic history book retelling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that the history, or at least the approved history of the U.S., would tell you that JFK actually saved the world because he's calm, cool-headed guy, and maybe they'll throw a bone at Khrushchev too, because Khrushchev also decided to make a deal instead of going to war. But I mean, you obviously have a reason for saying that you think that JFK almost got everybody killed. And what would that be?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think JFK is an interesting figure, and there's good and there's bad about him. This is one of the bad things that he did. But I'm honestly just quoting a lot from this Atlantic article, The Real Cuban Missile Crisis. It was written about 10 years ago or 11 years ago, and I'll just quote right from it. On October 16th, 1962, John F. Kennedy and his advisors were stunned to learn that the Soviet Union was, without provocation, installing nuclear-armed medium-intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. With these offensive weapons, which represented a new and accidental threat to America, Moscow significantly raised the ante in a nuclear rivalry between the superpowers, a gambit that forced the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. On October 22nd, the president, with no other recourse, proclaimed in a televised address that his administration knew of the illegal missiles and delivered an ultimatum insisting on their removal, announcing an American quarantine of Cuba to force compliance with his demands. While carefully avoiding provocative action and coolly collaborating each Soviet countermeasure, Kennedy and his lieutenants brooked no compromise. They held firm despite Moscow's effort to link a resolution to extinct issues and despite predictable Soviet blustering about American aggression in violation of international laws. In the tense 13-day crisis, the Americans and the Soviets went eyeball to eyeball. Thanks to the Kennedy administration's placid resolve and prudent crisis management, thanks to what Kennedy's special assistant Arthur Schlesinger Jr. characterized as the president's combination of toughness and restraint, of will, nerve, and wisdom, so brilliantly controlled, so majestically collaborated that it dazzled the world. The Soviet leadership blinked, Moscow dismantled the missiles, and a cataclysm was averted. Every sentence in this above paragraph describing the Cuban Missile Crisis is misleading or erroneous. And I'm still quoting this Atlantic article. It's very good. But this was a rendition of events that the Kennedy administration fed to the press. This was a history that the participants in Washington promulgated in their memoirs, and this is a story that has insinuated itself into the national memory.
Right. Very interesting.
Like I was saying before, I think there's a lot of things that are misunderstood about Kennedy. He's a very romanticized president because he died so young. I mean, he was assassinated.
Right. I mean, he was assassinated, yeah.
He was assassinated.
He was martyred in many ways, yeah.
He was martyred in any way, and I guess there's some things that were pretty admirable about him, but there was a lot of regression, I feel, that took place during his administration. I think a lot of the people he had in his staff were crazy and kind of led him into the wrong directions. And Mike Swanson, who's he's a hedge fund manager / historian. He writes really good books on the military industrial complex. He has a book called The War State, that I recommend reading. He basically makes the case in The War State that Kennedy was about to end the Cold War. Like he went through so much with like his advisors being crazy and the CIA and all these people he kind of realized were crazy, that he was actively trying to end the Cold War. And he doesn't really go into his assassination and try to like point fingers or blame or do an investigation on his actual assassination. He just kind of lays out the case that JFK was really trying to turn, like he saw how crazy a lot of people were in his in the government, and he wanted things to change. But as a congressman, he was a hardliner on the Cold War, just like a lot of other Democrats at the time. When Eisenhower was at the end of his second term, Democrats portrayed him as the old man asleep at the wheel. Kind of like Biden? kind of like how people portray Biden when they want to criticize him.
Yeah.
But I mean, Eisenhower is an objectively more impressive person than Joe Biden. The guy who, love him or hate him, the guy was the leader of Allied forces versus Joe Biden, the credit card salesman. Or the credit
well,
card.
Hey, give him some time, man. Maybe he'll avert a nuclear crisis of his own. You never know.
Let's hope so.
He pulled out of Afghanistan, didn't he?
Yeah, sure. He pulled out of Afghanistan, and now we're buying like meals that last like 60 years.
Seriously.
Now I'm building a bomb shelter. But you get the point. Eisenhower was having health issues at the end of his second term. He was getting up there in age, and that was just the popular way. That was just the easiest way to get at him. I mean, even in a Democratic primary, the other Democrats were going at Biden for his age. Now, they blamed him for the missile gap. The missile gap was the belief that the Soviets were surpassing the U.S. in their ICBM capability. They were able to push this narrative of the missile gap because in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. Mm-hmm. And they were also successfully testing ICBM units, and they were using the same type of rockets to launch Sputnik up. But there was also this secret report commissioned by Eisenhower that warned that the Soviets were ahead of missile technology in the U.S. And basically what it said was that there were hundreds of hidden Soviet ICBMs ready to launch a nuclear first strike on the U.S., and that America lost its first strike capability. Well, this ended up not being true at all. And the Soviets actually had far fewer nukes than the U.S. had at the time.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely think that the threat of the Soviet nuclear program, in the time, especially leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, was, let's call it, exaggerated in its capability. So at the time of the missile crisis, the Soviets had 36 ICBMs, so intercontinental ballistic missiles, 138 long-range bombers with 392 nukes attached to them, and 72 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, so SLBMs. So you can compare that to the U.S.'s arsenal at the same time, where they had 203 ICBMs, 1,300 long-range bombers with 3,000 nuclear warheads, and 144 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So if you add it all up, the U.S. had like 9 times more to work with missile-wise or nuke-wise than the Soviets did. And that's just the numbers. The quality of the U.S. missiles outmatched the Soviets by a lot, too. Apparently, Soviet ICBMs were reportedly very inaccurate, and more importantly, they took hours to prepare for a launch. And most importantly, I think, is that the U.S. had deployed their arsenal all over the place. So they had these intermediate range Jupiter nuclear missiles, and they were deployed in Italy and Turkey, so right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. And those missiles had the capability to strike Moscow in minutes. And the U.S. also had these nuclear-armed Thor missiles that they set up in bases in the U.K. The cherry on top of this is, of course, the Ron Paul, military doctrine, which is a bunch of nuclear-armed submarines. And we had a bunch of them that were lurking off the coast of the Soviet Union, just ready to shoot them. Now, the Soviet Union also had a lot of subs that were loitering on our coasts as well, but we had twice as many, right? And all of this is kind of important to think about when, especially before we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because when you get down to the bottom of the dangers of the crisis, it was less about a strategic shift in military capability, like for the Soviet Union, and more of a political theater that kind of went off the rails and threatened everybody.
Yeah. And that's important to bring up. Like, the Jupiter nuclear missiles. Have you ever seen a Jupiter nuclear missile?
Yeah, I actually looked at some pictures of them before the show.
Yeah, they're crazy. They're huge.
Yeah.
If you ever saw I think they're in the Space Museum in Washington, D.C. I think they have.
Yeah, they got the Air and Space ones. Yep.
Yeah, they have them there. They're fucking huge. They're humongous. They're not very discreet.
I'm trying to get a size on them.
They're not very discreet.
60 feet long, and they are about almost 9 feet wide, and I don't know where the weight is here. 110,000 pounds. It's a big missile.
They're not very discreet.
No, not even a little
bit.
Not.
They're not the type of system that you don't see. But let's put a pin in that. I want to talk about Kennedy and Eisenhower still, because basically during Kennedy's transition meeting with Eisenhower told him, he's like, hey, the missile gap that you campaigned on did not exist. It was complete, it was just complete political bullshit. It wasn't real.
Fake news.
It was fake news. I would know. I'm Dwight Eisenhower, and this was later all confirmed by Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense. Now, of course, Kennedy was either misled or he was just playing the politics card, because Kennedy was briefed by the CIA during the 1960 election that the Soviets Their ICBMs were much lower, but basically he was given like different estimates from the CIA and the Air Force, and the Air Force gave him a much larger figure. The Air Force was much more hawkish than the CIA at this time. Mm-hmm. And they gave him a much higher figure, and he went with the more political figure, or the more politically convenient to his campaign figure.
Right.
But I'm not trying to say that Eisenhower was perfect in any way. He did a lot of things that I disagree with in the 1950s, but I think at the very least Eisenhower did understand how horrible war was, and he really understood that he understood that what was happening at that time in the 1950s, because it was a really unique time, and it was a time when you really see the state and merge with defense contractors. Like you see the birth of the military-industrial complex comes out of World War II. Like all the business interests that contributed to the war effort, really they just wanted to keep the money flowing. And then they got political doctrine, like the NSC 68, signed and put into action that really just submitted them as full-time, I guess you could say, parasites to the government. I was trying to think of a nicer or more politically correct term to say, but parasite is the West word. That they're guaranteed existence, and that happened under Truman, but Eisenhower recognized that all this was going on because he knew these industries and he knew the military really better than anyone at the time. Now, Eisenhower, he ended the Korean War. He had cut the military budget by 1/3, and he repudiated NSC 68. But what his strategy was relying on the threat of massive nuclear retaliation. He was like a strategy guy, bridge player type who, liked to bluff a lot about nuking people. Now, the Kennedy administration, they reversed Eisenhower's back to something more like what Truman's foreign policy was. And if you listen to the debates between Kennedy and Nixon during the 1960s or the 1960 election, Kennedy was attacking Eisenhower for being weak on the Cuba situation. Well, what's interesting is that plans to overthrow Fidel Castro, they actually originated during the Eisenhower administration. And that was one of the main things they spoke about during their transition meeting, when Eisenhower told Kennedy that Castro has to go because, frankly, there was just too much business interest in the U.S. and Cuba. So, that obviously leads to the Bay of Pigs plot, which was conceived by the CIA, shortly after Kennedy was sworn into office. And, the operation goes terribly wrong. It was dependent on, the two projected events that did not occur, such as the assassination of Castro and then, the widespread uprising against the government. And it only took, I think, only 2 weeks for the Cuban military to repel the invaders. But the meeting between Eisenhower and Kennedy is like a real interesting thing to read about, because just like the age difference and like the gap of experience, and you read things like how Eisenhower was like trying to show, he was doing things to show the awesome responsibility of the president. Like he's like, hey, look at this, look what I can do. Here's a football. Like he like threw him the football. He's like, look out with these, like with that football, you can launch nuclear codes anywhere. He like ordered a helicopter right in front of him. He's like, hey, look at this. and he like makes a radio call, and a helicopter comes picks him up on the White House lawn. It's like a real interesting thing to read. But yeah, what do you think?
I mean, it's definitely interesting to hear about the political aspect on Cuba, because as I was doing research about this, it became very apparent to me that Kennedy was very fixated on this Cuba situation. And I guess it didn't really occur to me that, maybe part of the reason why he had such a sticking point with Cuba was because he made it his basically one of his campaign platforms. It was the boogeyman. It was the boogeyman, much like, I don't know how some politicians might call out, China or Russia, depending on what side of the aisle you fall on, or I don't know how like Trump might have been calling out fucking the border crisis, right? Like the border issue, or how Biden might be, calling out, I don't know, pick a thing, right? It didn't make sense to me when I was reading about this why Kennedy was so fixated on Cuba. But now that you bring it up, the fact that he was kind of attacking him from the right there, attacking Eisenhower is on the Cuba situation, I guess it kind of makes more sense now.
Yeah, and it just, Eisenhower basically had the same policy as Kennedy. So it was just like it's kind of like how everyone called Trump a Russian colluder, but Trump's policy towards Russia was like pretty status quo. It actually took Obama's policy a lot further in arming Ukraine. Like that juicing up period of the Ukrainian army between the Euromaidan and the civil war that breaks out in 2014, 2015, that juice up period of Ukraine losing battles to Donetsk and Luhansk, and losing battles to like this breakaway republic rebellion. And now they're not, I wouldn't say holding their own, but they're kind of holding their own against one of the best militaries in the world. And that all happened under Trump. Like that period of time of when the Ukrainian army improved so much happened under Trump. So
right,
it's kind of a weird. It's just not accurate to say that his policies were favorable to Russia.
Right, and it just shows that sometimes the politics that you hear, is not reflective of the reality on the ground, right? And there's often a big change there, but maybe we can take this opportunity just to talk about like what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't think anyone that listens to this show hasn't heard about it, but just wanted to give a quick recap on kind of the events and some of the things that precipitated around it. Just to give some context, and then after we do that, then we can chat about like what was the political thing that we were told, and that quote unquote history tells us, and what was the reality on the ground and the factors that played into it. So let's talk about Cuban Missile Crisis for a bit. So you remember my comment a little earlier about how Soviet ICBMs were poor in quality. I think just to expand on that a little bit, the fact that these missiles took forever to launch, it basically meant that they didn't serve as an effective deterrent against the U.S. if the U.S. decided to strike first. Now, what I mean by that is that, sure, they're fine, missiles on their own, but if we wanted to use them as a counterstrike, it just would take too long to spin them up as a countermeasure. Most of those missiles would likely be blown up by the U.S. while they were being fueled if the U.S. did decide on striking first. Now, like I said, it doesn't make those ICBMs useless. In the event that the Soviet Union decided to strike first, they had the capability to practically hit anywhere in the U.S. in minutes. And, the issue about accuracy really doesn't matter very much when you're talking about missiles with a blast yield that's greater than literally every nuclear bomb ever detonated in history, right? So, you don't have to have pinpoint accuracy, just somewhere close, and you get the point across, So both countries had, and largely still have, the capability to completely annihilate the other if they decided to strike first. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the disadvantage that the Soviet Union had, and that was that they lacked the ability to retaliate quickly with their ICBMs. What they did have, though, were these really great short and intermediate missile systems that were super fast to put into action. Now, those missiles, stationed in Russia or in the Soviet Union at the time, they could really ruin like any European country's day, but they just didn't have the range that was necessary to hit the U.S. On the other side of the world, the U.S.
It makes you think. It makes you just like think how frightened Europe was during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah,
because they were more.
Absolutely.
They were more scared than the United States. The European governments, they were like, "What the hell are they doing?"
Oh, I forgot who said this.
Which is parallel to what's going on now. I think to a lot of, maybe not to the governments of Europe because they're,
but for the people for sure.
But I think for the people I've talked to from Europe
this.
are
This is
like,
a really good quote from that Atlantic article that you were quoting before, and it said, "Oh shit, who said it?" It was something like, "It was annihilation without representation." Right. So basically, like being aligned with the U.S. Basically meant that if they fucked around and started a nuclear war, they're gonna die without having any say in it. And I think that's basically how they felt then. It's probably how a lot of people feel right now. But yeah, that was the situation. Anyway,
not annihilation without representation. The other point is that it's being an ally of America just makes it more dangerous for you.
Mm-hmm. In some ways, for sure.
In some ways. I guess that's subjective because you can find contradictions, but in some cases, being an ally of the U.S. could be more dangerous for you.
War.
In the case of Ukraine, it's more dangerous for them to be an ally of the United States. Maybe in the case of South Korea, I guess you could even make an argument against that as well.
Maybe. Anyway, back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Soviet Union has a little bit of a disadvantage for their retaliatory capability. And at the same time, the U.S. basically botched the attempt to overthrow the Castro regime during that Bay of Pigs invasion that you were talking about earlier. And that really presented the Soviet Union with a potential solution to their problem. Here we have, Cuba, who is a fellow comrade in the global communist revolution, right? And they're an ally to the Soviet Union. And they're also having like this personal beef with the U.S., especially around the Bay of Pigs. And so Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, they basically propose to Castro. They say, hey, we've got a deal for you. We think it's mutually beneficial. How about you just park some medium-range Soviet nukes, in Cuba? And for the Cubans, what they would gain would be a quick and devastating response to any future U.S. incursions, right? So they have nukes now. They have these great Soviet, medium-range missiles. And that by itself should ideally dissuade the U.S. from fucking around anymore in Cuba. And for the Soviets, they get to upgrade their nuclear deterrence. And I'll underscore the word deterrence here, right? So it's not first strike capability. They already have plenty of that, right? It's more like, hey, if you try something, we've got, missiles that can hit you in response. And by stationing them in, Cuba, they're just 90 miles from the U.S., so they've got perfect range. It seems like a perfect deal. Now, the drawbacks mostly fall on the Cubans in this case. Talk about annihilation by without representation here. They become a bigger target for the U.S. just by having these missiles. But after some back and forth, Castro takes the deal. And I think part of the reason why he does is because the precedent for placing these mid-range missiles, basically on your enemy doorstep was initiated by the U.S. already. We're already doing it by putting Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Now, I want to point out, just again, because this is important, that the proximities of these missiles, they really don't make a difference for a first strike. Both the US and the Soviet Union had those capabilities. They can pop missiles on each other's capital within minutes, no big deal, with their existing stockpile of ICBMs. Everybody was going to die regardless. But the strategic importance was, mainly in a response to the first strike. And that's why this option was considered and eventually taken up by Castro. And so in late August through September of 1962, the Soviet Union starts covertly shipping over a ton of stuff to Cuba, including 42,000 soldiers, a bunch of helicopters, bombers, patrol boats, anti-aircraft guns, fighter jets, and of course, medium-range ballistic missiles. And all of these make their way to Cuba. Now, because the U.S. had been beefing with Cuba this whole time, they were already doing a lot of monitoring of Cuba using the U-2 spy planes, which were really great because they can fly super, super high and take really great pictures. And so they had been monitoring this, and on October 16th, Kennedy gets briefed with these photos that were taken from a recon flight, and it showed these Soviet missiles in Cuba. And, the CIA starts telling Kennedy, like, hey, this is a problem because they can hit Washington now in minutes from Cuba. And, this is where the kind of the politics starts playing in a little bit. Kennedy starts getting super mad about this, but not just because he thinks this is a threat to the U.S., which I guess you could say it was. I mean, the threat was already there for a first strike if they wanted it, but, this is now like a new piece to the puzzle. But I think really why he was so mad is because the midterms were coming up. And, his political rivals had already been talking about how the Soviet buildup in Cuba was, that was their campaign issue. They were hitting him saying, hey, you're letting the Soviets install missile platforms 90 miles from Florida. What the fuck, right? And so this is starting to really get under Kennedy's skin. Now privately, Khrushchev had already told Kennedy by this point that the buildup in Cuba was totally defensive, basically saying like, hey, we're only putting this stuff here, all this military and all this hardware to protect Cuba from you fucking around in Cuba, just like you did in the Bay of Pigs. But we're not going to put any missiles there. And so Kennedy was like, all right, that's fair. But if you put missiles there, that's my red line. So he drew his little red line and he said, no missiles in Cuba. And now we've got evidence from this U-2 plane that they crossed the line. The Soviet Union crossed Kennedy's line. So at this point, Kennedy's got to put up or shut up, right? And, so he has this meeting with like 9 members of the National Security Council and a bunch of other experts. And this becomes known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. And some of the members basically, they start drawing up a bunch of crazy ideas. And a lot of them were, let's airstrike them, or let's do an airstrike plus an invasion. And Bobby Kennedy really liked this idea for whatever reason, because he fucking hated Castro.
And Bobby Kennedy is portrayed as like the most, like his sober-minded brother who was steering the ship in the right direction.
If it was up to Bobby Kennedy, we wouldn't exist.
I'm a Bobby Kennedy fan. Like I like Bobby Kennedy more than JFK, but I don't know. It's pretty damning.
On this issue, though, Bobby Kennedy was
on the stuff that he was endorsing. He was endorsing like really the most extreme responses to it, like just full out invasion. Like that's what he was. He was like, no, let's not even do like airstrikes. Let's just invade them.
Yeah, let's just go right now. Yeah, it's crazy. He was like, not trying to make a judgment on Bobby Kennedy overall, but on this particular topic, like he was fucking crazy. He was crazy. And so, all of this is bubbling, and Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, JFK, he also felt like, he can't not do something because, that would hurt him. It would hurt the U.S. because, if we cave on our own red line, then that's bad and it makes us look weak. But more importantly, it would hurt him politically. But the problem was that if they attack Cuba and kill a bunch of Soviet Union soldiers, that's war. That's like immediate war with the Soviet Union. And so he's trying to balance and juggle these two things. And I can't even imagine what it was like to be Kennedy at that moment, just because he kind of put his foot in his mouth, drew a red line very publicly, they crossed it, and now you got to decide what to do. So Kennedy settles on this plan, and you mentioned it already. It was to blockade Cuba, but he doesn't call it a blockade. He calls it a quarantine, because a blockade would also be an act of war. So it's just a little legalese here, right? You can think of it like how Putin is calling the invasion in Ukraine not a war, but a special operation, right?
Hey, the Korean War, the podcast that we still owe you, like 5 more episodes on, was a police action, not a war.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing. While there was evidence of missiles in Cuba, the intelligence that Kennedy was getting was suggesting that the nuclear warheads had not yet made it to Cuba. So they had the missiles, but not the warheads. So the plan for this, quarantine was to set up basically like a naval version of the TSA around Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from, arming Cuba with those warheads. And so on October 22nd, at 7 p.m., Kennedy goes live on TV, and he announces that there are nuclear weapons in Cuba. So I'm going to quote him. He says, within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The whole of this offense built up a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment. On the shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launches from Cuba or any other nation in the or against any other nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. So here he goes again, publicly stating and drawing a new red line. He's like, hey, you guys fuck around. If Cuba shoots a missile, if anyone shoots a missile, and not just at us, but literally any other country in the Western Hemisphere, we're going to count that as Soviet Union attacking the U.S., and we're going to have to respond militarily. So at this point, the U.S. goes to DEFCON 3, which means that missiles and bombers can be launched within 15 minutes of a presidential order. And at the same time...
DEFCON 1 means nuclear war is upon us, right? And then DEFCON 2 means we're very close. DEFCON 1 is the maximum readiness. DEFCON 5 is the lowest readiness. DEFCON 1 basically means, okay, say goodbye to your family.
Right. So, all right. We're at DEFCON 3. Not quite DEFCON 1, but still pretty bad. Castro decides to call up a bunch of troops, so he calls up 300,000 men to defend the island. He also sends his brother to take an artillery force and surround Guantanamo Bay, and I think he also sends Che Guevara to make preparations for an impending guerrilla war. So they're fucking ready to fight. And 100 miles away in Florida, we start seeing a U.S. buildup of troops. So there was something like 120,000 servicemen that gathered in Florida for an impending invasion. And this force was nearly as large as the one that was deployed on D-Day. So huge military operation. Everybody's ready to go. At the same time, Khrushchev, he's like, oh shit, this is too hot, and decides to order the missile freighters that were en route to Cuba to turn around and come back to the Soviet Union, because he didn't want to risk them being boarded and or captured. But he does this interesting thing, which is he goes ahead and says the rest of the freighters, the ones that don't have missiles, the ones delivering food and fuel, they can keep going, right? So he's just trolling Kennedy a little bit, because if he searches those ships and finds nothing, it just makes the U.S. look stupid. And so a lot of shit's going on right now, and tensions are super high. Kennedy ends up delaying the quarantine by 1 day in order to look for international support. Because he's trying to get everybody to agree to what they're doing. Because let's be honest, what he's doing is kind of illegal, and that gave Khrushchev enough time actually to turn some of those freighters around and go ahead and sneak them into Cuba. So they were able to get the warheads to Cuba. And the whole time, the U.S. had been flying these recon sorties over Cuba, and some of them were flying as low as 1,000 feet off the ground, which is really starting to piss off Castro because, they're obviously violating Cuban airspace, but they had been told to like stand down, like chill out. But his patience is growing a little bit thin here. So Kennedy finally comes around to signing the quarantine officially, and that's in full swing. But there's so many problems with this. It was kind of like cobbled together so quickly that, XCOM and the military are struggling to figure out like what's the right approach to actually go through with the quarantine. Like how do we stop these ships from coming into Cuba? Like you can't just blow them up because that would be war. Like we have to figure out a way to like, I don't know, disable them somehow and, get them to stop without actually just like killing them, So whole crazy ass debate goes on. And what's important is that there's just literally so much radio traffic that's going around this whole time that getting really, really important messages across to leadership was literally taking hours, and that's kind of important because anything could happen in this moment. And, we're talking about the 60s here, they don't have the things that we have now, and tensions are super high. A lot of chess pieces are being put in place. So, really the decision making happens on the ground. And that's what was incredibly scary about that. Now, Khrushchev, on the other side, privately decided that, basically we can't go to war, that war is a bad idea, but that he couldn't buckle to U.S. pressure because that would destroy him politically, right? So you have on the one side Kennedy feeling like, shit, they crossed the line, but I can't do nothing because that makes me look bad and midterms are coming up. And Khrushchev is basically experiencing the same thing on his side. He's like, well, shit, I can't go to war with them, but I also can't walk away without a win on this because it would destroy me politically. So they're both feeling this political pressure, and it's kind of fueling and influencing their decision making. So what Khrushchev ends up coming up with, after like a late night with, all of his advisors, is that he proposes to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in return for Kennedy to promise to never invade Cuba. The thing about that is that he wrote this super long thing, and it obviously needs to be translated, and then it needs to be transmitted to Washington. And that would take 8 hours to get to the U.S. That's a really long time. So again, this is before that like special phone line that they set up between Washington and the Kremlin. This is before the internet, right? So literally any little thing could have happened in the 8 hours that it took for that deal to get sent over. It could have been a war. A war could have broken out before the message even got there. So, and we got Castro again. So Castro obviously is losing his patience. He got super annoyed initially that Khrushchev ordered the freighters to turn around. And he was also pissed off at the Soviet ambassador in the U.S. because he was denying the existence of the missiles in Cuba at the time. Because again, like the orders were taking super long to go around. He didn't have any instructions on what to say or what to do, so he was just denying everything, despite the fact that everyone has evidence of it. And so that's important because the public existence of missiles in Cuba was Castro's like ticket to safety in a way. If everybody in the American public knew that, Castro's got nukes, then everybody in the American public would be like, maybe we shouldn't invade them, because that's a bad idea. So coming back to these reconnaissance flights, because these were also really pissing off Castro. And while they definitely had the ability to shoot down these planes, they'd been holding their fire. And so he gets really mad and he writes a letter to the UN, and he basically threatens to, shoot down any planes that violate Cuban airspace. So at the same time, Kennedy finally gets the deal from Khrushchev, and he really wants to take that deal. But the press at this point is really, really hyping up the idea of invading Cuba, right? So now he's got this extra pressure, right? Press is all saying, yeah, there's going to be invasion. We're about to invade Cuba, whatever. And if he takes this deal, it's going to make him look weak. Again, the politics around this is palpable. So, what is he going to do? A little bit later, the Soviets pick up a U-2 plane flying over Cuba, and the Cubans shoot it down, right? And this is the first, I guess you can call this the first casualty in this conflict. But again, shit takes a really long time to get transmitted, right? So, the U.S. doesn't know that one of their U-2 planes got shot down over Cuba just yet. It would take a couple hours beforehand. And kind of around the same time, and this is fucking crazy and kind of like bad timing by Khrushchev in this respect, but around the same time, the Soviet Union is conducting a missile test, a nuclear missile test in the Arctic. And, they detonate a bomb, and the U.S. simultaneously sends a plane over, from Alaska to go collect samples of the air. I don't know why. It's just bad ideas all over the place, right? We're in a crazy conflict. Let's blow up a nuke. And then the other crazy idea is, hey, they just blew up a nuke. Let's go take samples of that. Like, all of this is happening at the same time. So the plane gets lost, and inadvertently it crosses into Soviet Union airspace, and it's stalked by these MiGs, these fighter jets. Eventually, the plane gets back to the base in Alaska, and the funny part about this is that the pilot had no idea. He almost died. He had no idea that he was being tracked by those planes. He had no idea that he crossed into the Soviet Union. He only figured it out when he landed, which is nuts. And, okay, so around the same time period, I'm just like highlighting all the shit that's bubbling up here. And this is so important because, like I said, communication is real slow, and literally anything can happen. And literally a lot of things were happening that could have gone wrong. And this is the last thing that I want to talk about. For 2 days, an American destroyer had been tracking a Soviet sub, and they finally caught it. They finally caught the sub. And so the protocol that they were told to do was to signal it, to get it to come up to the surface so that they can talk, right? This was all part of the blockade, the quarantine that they called it. And so they start by just dropping some grenades in the water and blowing them up, and that's how they were signaling it. But they didn't get any responses out of that, so they start using depth charges or practice depth charges. In any case, they were blowing shit up near the sub to basically get its attention. And this is kind of important because the way that these subs worked at the time is that you just can't communicate from underwater with pretty much anyone. So they can't communicate with the warship because they're underwater. So they'd have to come up to communicate with them. But they also couldn't communicate with the Soviet Union at all. So they're God knows how far under the water. They have no idea what's going on. And a lot of the people on the ship are thinking, shit, those are depth charges. Did the war start already? Is it war? And that was a nuclear capable submarine. And on this ship, this is the famous story where they had to make a decision on whether or not to strike and use those nuclear torpedoes. And there were 3 officers on board, and the rules were that they all had to unanimously decide on whether or not they would fire this nuke. And one of them was Commander Vasily Arkhipov, and he was the dude who said, nah, let's not fire the nukes, and basically averted nuclear winter with that decision. He was like the one guy that actually had some wherewithal to be like, nope, not going to do that. So all of this shit is happening. Literally, it could have been the sub. It could have been the U-2 plane being shot down. It could have been the plane that crossed into Soviet Union airspace. And there was probably a million other situations that could have popped off for a war. All of these things are happening. And, literally every hour counts. The crisis ends, ultimately diplomatically, and a deal is reached between Khrushchev and Kennedy where the Soviet Union would pull out of Cuba and the U.S. would, promise not to invade it. But secretly, Kennedy offered to pull the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but he also did that in a back door, sent his brother to go pass along that message, and even told told the ambassador to say, hey, if you leak the details of this secret deal, the deal is off. So, but we wouldn't learn about this until years later after all this shit was declassified. That's the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis in a nutshell. It's just crazy.
So, what do you think about this? And I think I know what your answer is going to be. So much of this was politically motivated with the midterms coming up. When Biden runs for re-election, which I think he probably still will at this point, right? I don't think anyone else is behind him. Do you think he's still running? Probably, right?
I mean,
well, whatever.
That's yet to be seen. But even though with that question off the table, we still have midterms coming up, right?
Yeah,
and that's still politically important for the president, regardless of the fact that he's not on the ticket. Point.
I'm wondering though, when someone's running against them, I guess we live in such a short news cycle now that people, there might be a whole new crisis in 2 years from now during the election.
Right. We all thought that Afghanistan was going to be the hot button topic for the midterms, and now check this out.
Do you think Republicans running against them are most likely going to, they're going to criticize him for being too weak on Russia? They're not going to be like, oh, look at this mess he got us into. They're going to be like, oh, you're just not strong enough.
Yeah, they're going to be like, oh, you let Putin invade Ukraine and kill all those people. The blood is on your hands because you didn't do more to stop big bad Russia. Yeah, they're going to hit him with that.
And then the solution would have been some vague promise about credibility and alliances. Well, what we would have done is that we would have been credible to our partners in NATO, and we would have built a stronger alliance and would have shown Putin that we mean real business. That would have been that. Yeah. That's the speech. That's the level of foreign policy rhetoric you're going to get. We're going to just talk to our credible partners from across, almost like a PR statement from like a company that just like killed a bunch of like seals with an oil spill or something. It's
well, I mean, what's eye-opening about that is that I definitely think that that's an option for the Republicans for the midterm elections. I definitely think that will be a talking point. And what's funny about that is that they would be effectively attacking a Democrat, from I can't even call it from the left, right? It's like attacking a Democrat on a Democrat issue, right? Where the Democrats don't like Russia and the Republicans don't like China. It's like, oh, well, you weren't very good when you were in power against your boogeyman. It's fascinating. And it sounds just like how Kennedy was saying how, you're not doing enough on Cuba, and in the same vein, or on the missile gap. But at the same time, like Eisenhower had already had shit in play and he was just being misled. So, but it's just the political theater of it, right? Like how are they going to position this to benefit politically in the midterm? Absolutely see that happening.
If Trump runs again, he'll just be like, I like Putin, but I would nuke Moscow. I would do it. He wouldn't have done it, but he wouldn't have done it. He wouldn't have done it.
If Biden didn't steal the election, Putin would have never did this. He saw Biden as weak.
He was old and feeble. Okay, he wouldn't. My Trump isn't very good. Well, I guess time will tell.
We'll see.
I'm very doubtful it will be his criticism will be of substance. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, I guess just to recap everything. In short, the Cuban Missile Crisis was started due to the deployment of intermediate-range Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And putting them in striking distance to Moscow. Because you hit on this, and we spoke about the size of the Jupiter missile, but again, it's above ground. It's not in some silo. It's a big thing that you can see from anywhere, meaning that they are extremely vulnerable
to a first strike, which also means that they encourage a first strike because they're not a deterrent. Like if you could, like a deterrent is like a submarine. Like you can't see the submarine, you know they're out there and they can poke out and they can destroy you. But if it's gonna just be out there and for you to see, like you have to assume
like an easy target. Yeah,
it's it's meant, if it's an easy target, then you have to assume it's not meant to be there that long and it's meant to fly in the air and kill you. So let me go back to this because this Atlantic article I thought is a real good article. It's basically kind of recaps Sheldon Stern's book on Kennedy, who's a Kennedy historian who wrote I think 3 different books on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But let me quote this. The other missiles of October, Kennedy's deployment of the Jupiter missiles was a key reason for Khrushchev's decision to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. Khrushchev reportedly made the decision in May 1962, declaring to a confidant that the Americans have surrounded us with bases on all sides, and that missiles in Cuba would help to counter an intolerable provocation, keeping the deployment secret in order to present the U.S. with a fait accompli. Khrushchev may very well have assumed America's response would be similar to his reaction to the Jupiter's missiles, rhetorical denouncement, but no threat or action to thwart the deployment with a military attack, nuclear or otherwise. Khrushchev explained his reasoning to the American journalist Strobe Talbot. Americans would learn just what it feels like to have an enemy missiles pointed at you. We'd be doing nothing more than giving them a little bit of their own medicine.
Mm-hmm. And he thought that, Kennedy wouldn't do shit about it because they didn't do shit about the missiles in Turkey.
You can also look at Khrushchev. Khrushchev was like a peasant. Did you know that? He was like a literal peasant from the Russian Empire who rose up to become the leader of the Communist Party, like the top guy after Joseph Stalin. And Kennedy is a rich boy.
If I was a rich boy,
he's a rich boy who's young, and I think Khrushchev probably thought he could walk all over him. Now, I think the Soviet Union was also motivated because they really did believe that the Kennedy administration was hell-bent on destroying the Castro regime, which they seemed like they were. I mean, after all, the administration had launched an invasion on Cuba, and the CIA was, I don't know how many clandestine operations that were going on in the Caribbean islands, involving training up rebels and things like that. But I mean, how many times did the CIA try to kill Castro?
A lot.
50? I forget the number. It's something ridiculous where it's like, how did you not kill him already? You tried 50 times. One of them.
My favorite was the bomb in the cigar.
Yeah,
that idea was kind of funny.
How many? You think? I mean, come on, man. There's better odds of him getting killed by a shark.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, come on. If the CIA tries to assassinate you 54 times, it's a 2% success rate. I mean, you're more likely to be killed by a lot of other things, like by cancer, by heart disease.
Well, certainly for Castro, it would have been cancer.
Yeah. I guess Castro did die of cancer, but I mean, Castro died when he was he died when he was in his 80s. So
yeah,
I think once you die in your 80s, it's pretty much natural causes.
Right.
But where was I going with this? I mean, I think the Kennedy administration was aware that their policy in Turkey with these Jupiter missiles was going to provoke the Soviet Union, because the Kennedy was recording his meetings on the Cuban Missile Crisis. You could find them on YouTube, his executive meetings where he talks about this. And one of the meetings, he says, why does he put these there, though? It's just as if we suddenly began to put a major number of medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey. Let me read it more sarcastically, because that's the tone of it. It's like, why does he put these in there, though? It's just like, as if we suddenly began to put a major number of medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey. Now, that'd be a goddamn dangerous, I would think. And then the George Bundy, the National Security Advisor, points out, well, we did, Mr. President. But he was making a joke. You'd think I'd... Sarcasm. Maybe I'll play it. But...
Yeah, the point was that he it's not that he didn't know, it's that he was like being facetious about it.
Yeah. He's making a joke. Now, and then the other thing that you hit on, and I don't think it's worth diving too much because you did a good job explaining it, but the missiles didn't really change the strategic balance. Like the missiles in Cuba didn't make us more... Like missiles existing in Cuba did not make Americans less safe, because we already were extremely unsafe.
Right.
So it wasn't
missile's
like...
a missile is a missile.
Yeah, missile's a missile, and there's meetings, there's recordings, and there's Kennedy's outright sayings and people in his administration are basically saying, I mean, a missile's a missile. If you die from a missile that's 90 miles away, or if you die from a missile that's 3,000 miles away, still a missile that killed you. Like, no difference.
Yeah. And what's important is that at the time we didn't have the capabilities to even attempt to shoot like an ICBM out of the sky. Even now it would be kind of hard, although we have better chances now. But like at that time, it didn't fucking matter. It didn't matter. Once someone decided to shoot a nuke, you're fucked. That's pretty much it. Everyone's fucked, really, because that's nuclear war.
Yeah. What's the difference if a missile comes from Cuba or if it comes from the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it comes from a submarine?
That's right.
A missile is a missile. All right, we're an hour and 10 minutes in or so. I say we wrap this one up because it is Friday night.
Absolutely. I think the only thing I want to talk about is just kind of underscore how there's this idea that, Kennedy was a hero, and I guess, ends justifying the means. I guess you could call him a hero for not just going ahead and pushing the button and just saying, fuck it, let's just nuke Cuba, right? Or whatever. But really it was kind of like just this conflagration of all this political shit, right? And I got to bring it back to the situation in Ukraine and how, and I'm having trouble drawing these distinctions, so maybe you can help me a little bit, but it does feel as if we're playing a very dangerous game of chicken, and as was the case in during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what seems to be the defining factor in decision making is not strategic, certainly isn't empathetic to human life, but it's just kind of political. Like the options that we put on the table are political.
Well, government at the end of the day is always doing things to legitimize itself. And if a government is not... The purpose of a government is like to protect property rights for its people, to make sure, like the whole reason why you buy into this monopoly on violence over you is that this monopoly on violence is going to protect you from outside threats. And if they can't do that, or if they are perceived not to do that, or if they are perceived not to be the baddest, the biggest, baddest, monopoly on violence out there, then they start to lose legitimacy, whether that be warranted or not. Politicians can play off that and do a significant amount of damage to you if they play their cards right. So politicians are always, and especially in America in the 20th in the 21st century, have always operated under that. So the parallels are very similar. They're both dangerous games of chicken. And I think right now a lot of things that the Biden administration is doing is to they're trying to like legitimize American hegemony without the sacrifice. So they're using, Ukrainians as cannon fodder. So, but they still want to like be able to be like, oh, we acted and we're doing something. But
here's an opportunity to stick it to Russia, right?
Yeah.
They're having a tiff with Ukraine.
Western society can't stomach casualties. So
here's a question I got for you.
We can popular if people start dying. American soldiers start dying.
Well, here's a question that could potentially be in that vein, and then we can wrap it. What if, Putin can't hit us with sanctions? That's just not something that he can retaliate with, right? But if one of Putin's gripes with the situation is NATO expansion, what if he counter expands to balance the power? So, obviously taking the Donbass would be one way, but that doesn't really affect the U.S. in a great way. What if they go to like Venezuela or, some other South American country that's sympathetic, or to Brazil or some shit like that, and decide to set up shop there, creating like a new Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0, Like what do you think the chances are of that, and how do you think the U.S. would react to something like that, given the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, if they made they would probably bomb that country and remove its government from power.
You think we'd go the Bobby Kennedy route?
Well, it depends on what they did. We were just talking about like if they put nuclear missiles in Venezuela. What's the difference of them? Like even more so now, like they can nuke us from anywhere.
Right.
They can send they have hypersonic missiles that can carry that can deliver warheads in 5 minutes.
Allegedly.
But I think according to Ted Postal, that's true. And it's, what's the difference if they launch a missile from South America, or if they launch a missile from a submarine, or they launch a missile from, wherever in Russia? I don't really think
they got nuclear
difference.
Capable bombers. They got nuclear capable bombers in Venezuela. That happened back in 2018. We didn't do shit then.
So it really depends on. It just depends on like the willingness to go. It depends on like how it's perceived by like a lot of different actors, by the media and by other countries. I wish I could give you a better answer right now, but
I think you're onto something. Honestly, I think you're onto something, and I think that perception has to be a negative political perception for there to be.
Yeah, it depends on that's exactly what I'm trying to say. It depends on the political perception. It doesn't matter what changes on the military or strategic disadvantage or advantage. It's purely political, like how that's picked up in the news. If the corporate press decided to just be like, okay, oh my God, Venezuela has Russian bombers there. We have a president who's not defending Americans. We need to act now. And they started pressing them.
Right.
The media, people think the media being like real hawkish is new. The media has always been real hawkish. The media was real hawkish in the 60s. The media is real hawkish in the 70s. The media has always been very, very hawkish. So it's not a new thing. The media has been very hawkish in World War I. That, like, people think that we're experiencing new heights of, like, authoritarianism or censorship. We did an episode on Woodrow Wilson in World War I, how they would just round up journalists and throw them to jail, and they had, like, street squads that would beat the shit out of dissenters against World War I. The Civil War.
Yeah, we think it's like new
habeas
for what
corpus
Russia
was
does.
It's not,
you know.
Well, I'm just saying, like, in America right now,
Yeah.
you know, there's a lot of backlash against people who are speaking out against U.S. foreign policy.
That's right.
You and I have both experienced it firsthand. However, it's not comparable to, like, what the government was doing in World War I to dissenters. Like, magazine, like, the only way to transmit ideas back in those times was through magazines, and magazine publications were just shut down.
Super easy to keep people quiet.
Yeah, very, very much easier to keep people quiet. There were literally, like, you know, patriot clubs where they would go kick the shit out of people who were anti-war.
That's
so
crazy.
It's kind of like a stock market, you know, it goes up and down. Maybe there'll be a time in America that people will be, like, smarter and not as crazy, but it will probably go back up again where people are crazy again. Maybe in 10 years from now, people will be like, oh man, we were really close to getting to something really nasty, but maybe 10 years from then, 20 years from now, there will be, like, another event where everyone's like, oh,
people go crazy again.
Annihilate these people. That's just the human nature, unfortunately. All right. I'm not making sense anymore. So I think it's time to end this podcast.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys, for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you want to support the show, rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support the show. You can also support us on our Patreon. You can join our Slack, which is a fun way to communicate with us, and we have a great channel. So come to our Slack channel, join us on Patreon. Anything else?
No, man, I'm good.
All right, peace.
Peace.